Welcome to the Jewish Education Experience podcast with your hosts, Yasmina and Ari, who will be uncovering gems of wisdom with Jewish educators from around the world.
To our audience, thank you so much. We really appreciate your support, and we appreciate you sharing our podcast with others also. Please consider supporting our podcast financially by contributing via Zelle, jewisheducationpodcast@gmail.com, or by joining our Patreon community, www.patreon.com/Jewish Education Experience Podcast. And to all of you Jewish educators and students of Jewish education around the world, chizchu ve'imtzu. May you be strengthened and encouraged in your holy endeavors. Please remember to hit that subscribe button so that you'll be notified whenever we post a new video. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed in this podcast may not necessarily be those of the hosts. Hello, our guest today is Aaron Hahn-Tapper. And hello, Aaron. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being with us today. We're very excited.
My pleasure.
And Aaron, you are currently a professor at the University of San Francisco. Is that right?
That is right.
Very cool. Will you please tell us a bit more about yourself and how you began your journey in education?
Sure. So I'm in my 14th year at the University of San Francisco. I'm a professor of Jewish studies, and I'm in the theology and religious studies department there. And I direct a program called the Swig Program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice. We're the only academic program worldwide, actually, that front and center links Jewish studies with social justice. I grew up in Philadelphia. I went to 13 years of Jewish day schools, 10 summers at overnight camp, studied in various seminaries, yeshivot, after college, and eventually made my way to graduate school in religious studies because I wanted to better understand my own religious tradition in the context of other religions. And that opened up a whole number of doors, and I did a master's degree in comparative religions, and then I spent a number of years doing one-off programs in Jerusalem and Cairo, and eventually did a PhD in religious studies at the University of California in Santa Barbara. So I am originally an East Coaster, but I converted to California, I like to say, about 20 years ago.
Wow.
I saw the light. And so along the way, excuse me, I met my now partner, my now wife, Lori Hahn-Tapper, and we were blessed to have 2 children. And that's a snapshot of how I ended up here.
So what do you like better, East or West?
Oh, it's no question. I'm sorry. West. I mean,
Gotta be the weather, right?
yeah. No, I'm also in Northern California. So Northern California is just beautiful, and the weather is pretty amazing. I go back east, COVID aside, I go back east with the family once a year, maybe twice a year, because I'm the only one from my family who moved out west.
Okay, so everyone else is back east.
Yeah, so I'm still an East Coaster at heart, and when I meet people out here in California, I always know who's a East Coaster, not necessarily by an accent, although that sometimes gives it away, but it's more of a certain edge that East Coasters have, especially when I say East Coast, I really mean the Northeast corridor, kind of.
They walk a little bit faster, right?
Yeah, everything faster, talk faster. Man, interrupt a lot more. That
Interesting.
that kills me actually, because I didn't realize it to the extent that I do now. You leave a place and you return to it and you see it with new eyes. So
That's true.
I'm a Philly boy at heart, but I converted. California.
Right. So you social justice. So you're like an expert in Tikkun Olam.
I don't know about an expert. I certainly study it, and I've read a lot of books on it and talked to a lot of people about it.
Is that kind of what you mean when you say social justice?
Yeah, that is kind of what I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is what I mean. I mean, I also have like a very technical kind of academic definition of it, but
Right.
if I'm not in the classroom and I'm just speaking with people who we probably have a common language in terms of terms, yes. If someone's familiar with the term tikkun olam, or really the idea, as you two are, of course, then I would say, yeah, absolutely, that's what I mean.
Wow.
I guess what's the goal with your program and the way you are talking about social justice in Judaism with your students that you teach?
Most of our courses, we try to focus on social identities and bringing social identities to the fore of to the front and center in our courses. So, for instance, I teach a course every fall called Social Justice, Activism, and Jews. And we look at the social identities of race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, gender, sex, sexual orientation. And through those lenses, we look at how society has been structured such that people with particular identities in those categories have more power or less power, dominance or marginalized. And then I integrate Jews into the whole thing. So I bring in about 10 speakers during the semester, all of whom identify as Jewish and all of whom work on social justice issues related to one of those social identity categories, but they also usually embody those categories.
Very interesting.
So, I mean, we're really trying to get our students to take responsibility for themselves in the world and engage in the world, realize them, kind of a Heschel idea of some are guilty, all are responsible.
Mm-hmm.
And we focus on intersectionality and figuring out where one should put their energies in terms of playing a role in bettering society.
Wow.
So interesting.
So are there any educators that you particularly admire?
Yeah, so I mean, I thought about that question. You all sent me. Yeah, there's a bunch that I've worked with. One is frankly my partner, my wife. She's a rabbi. She is the rabbi and the head of Jewish studies and integrated learning at a Jewish day school out here where our kids go, and have gone for years. And she's an extraordinary teacher and educator. Even over about 15 years ago, we actually co-taught a university course.
Wow.
And that was pretty interesting, seeing how she teaches certain texts and how I approach them with students. There's other people at the University of San Francisco that I've been privileged enough to work with, and some of whom eventually get hired so we can work together. And there's a handful. In terms of like a pedagogue, like an educational theorist, I'd say Paulo Freire. His One of his famous books, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, has played a profound role in helping shape my understanding of what my purpose is in the classroom. And he speaks out against a banking theory of education where you go into the classroom and you're trying to deposit information into students, and really speaks much more to social identities and the relations between student and teacher, and how there's a power differential and how that can play out. So a lot of that has been helpful in helping me figure out how to be or how to improve my own teaching in the classroom.
Wow. All right. Yeah. So we're curious, how does God fit into this? How do you talk about God, and how might that differ with the various age groups you teach? Um, I guess we should just clarify. You teach, you're a full-time professor, right?
Yeah, so I'm a full-time professor. So since I started at USF in 2007, and primarily since that time at USF, since that time, I've only dealt with undergraduate and graduate students.
Okay.
I used to teach a graduate program in a graduate program at USF. So there I would have students who are a bit older, maybe 20s and 30s. But in general, my undergraduate students range from 18 to 25 or so, but usually closer to 20 years old. But over the course of the last 25 plus years, I've worked with sixth graders on up, but most of that's been a long time ago. So in terms of say the last 15 years, the concept of God, it really depends on what course I'm teaching. Um, for the most part, the courses social justice, activism, and Jews, we only talk about God if a one of the speakers brings it into the conversation.
Mm.
So I teach at a University of San Francisco is a Jesuit Catholic school, so it wouldn't be a problem to talk about God uh, every class to some degree because I'm in the theology and religious studies department. But um, really, we mostly talk about God in when I teach our Intro to Judaism course called Jews, Judaisms, and Jewish Identities. And in that course, for a portion of it, we just speak about different Jewish understandings of God. Um, but that's more of like, say, a stereotypical way of speaking about God. I mean, in some sense, if we define God as purpose or meaning or responsibility, I mean, it really depends on how we unpack the term God. And in some capacity, I teach about God all the time, just not using the word God.
Is there some sort of common ground, would you say, at the university there, that
Yeah.
if you were to mention God, you think people are pretty much understanding it in one specific way?
Yes and no. I mean, about 30%. So our campus is pretty extraordinary. We're in terms of statistical data, we're the top in the top five of campuses in the whole country, racially and ethnically, in terms of diversity.
Wow.
Um, and 1/3 of our students are the first in their family to go to college or university. We have a significant number of international students, although that has declined in recent years, like most colleges in America. So it's a pretty, our classes cap at 40 students. And so if I have a group of 40 students in front of me, they're pretty racially and ethnically diverse. And so we have a lot of diversity in terms of social identities, and also in terms of socioeconomics, et cetera. 1/3 of our students are also identify as Catholic, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are so-called believing Catholics. So, in many ways, it's a cross section of students who are 20 years old or so in terms of their understanding of God. Um, so it really it would be quite an interesting conversation, but I wouldn't say necessarily that there would not there would be common ground insofar as most students in the classroom are American. So we would have some sort of dominant tropes and dominant ideas that everyone would have in common, not necessarily that they agree with, but just part of kind of normal discussion in the United States per se.
Right.
Okay.
Because you kind of mentioned meaning and purpose, but like,
Yeah.
is it safe to say when you say God, you're kind of talking about a higher power?
Yeah.
Do you get into creator of the world, or is that already too specific?
Only in the Intro to Judaism course we get into creator of the world.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. Do you
But
know how many of your students, what percentage are Jewish?
so we have about 6,500 undergrads and somewhere around 4,000 grads, give or take. So our estimates are, meaning the small group of Jewish studies and social justice faculty, our estimates are that about 10% of campus is Jewish.
Okay.
But that's because that's our own. We're the only ones who would say that on campus. Well, first off, no one would, most people on campus wouldn't even care. But admissions would probably say it's closer to 3 or 4%. But they're talking about undergrads, right? When there's informal surveys for undergrads of how do you identify religiously, right? But you have 35-40% of Jews under the age of 40 who don't identify as Jewish as their religion, but it's their ethnicity or heritage or culture. So if admissions is saying, do you identify as Jewish? Is it your religion? And the other choices you have are Catholic, Muslim, Protestant, whatever. Well, you're not gonna get the data that you want, right? Because if you have a younger Jew who it's not their religion but it's their culture, then they would say no. So, but it's also California, right? California has the highest rate of Jews marrying non-Jews in the country. So we have a fair number of students who identify as Jewish, meaning they don't necessarily identify as Jewish. They weren't necessarily raised as Jewish, but one of their parents might be Jewish or one of their grandparents might be Jewish. And one of the reasons they end up in our classroom is because they're kind of exploring that part of their identity.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And it sounds like you have a good number of non-Jews who are also interested.
Yeah, absolutely. Most of our students in the Jewish studies classes are non-Jews. We have a fair number of Jewish studies courses though. We've built it up the last 15 years, and in 2019-20 we had 40 courses that we offered in Jewish studies, and we had over 900 students over the course of the school year. So we really we reach a lot of students, and absolutely most of them are non-Jews.
Interesting.
How would you define education?
Yeah, specifically, in Hebrew, chinuch, right?
Yeah. I of course thought about that as well. I mean, in some sense, it's learning something, right? And I do think there is a certain need for a banking methodology of education. I think one needs to have some data, right? If you're learning about Jewish history, you could learn some of the dominant motifs that are being taught in Jewish communities right now. Those aren't necessarily reflective of the majority of Jewish history, but it'd be useful in learning more about Jews to know how are Jews teaching other Jews about Jews, right? So learning something is like a baseline level of education, but I'd say, in the same way that there's a traditional four-way approach to psukim verses from the Torah, right? You have your pshat, your literal or simplistic, your remez, where there's a hint, kind of a secondary layer, tertiary layer, third layer is drash, kind of a midrash, and final one sod. I'd say pshat, the simplest way that I understand education is kind of a banking method where you're just incorporating data, right? What's the definition of social justice? What's the definition of oppression? What's the definition of intersectionality? You need to know those basic terms in order to move to the next level. And I'd say remez, this secondary approach to education, might be looking more at one's own social identity in terms of the classes that I teach, and really developing an awareness of your social identities and power relations and what it means when you walk down the street and or encounter other people, especially authority figures, such as police or what have you. Right. So I'd say there's a lot of, and then you can go deeper there. So I say there's different levels to education, and the deepest levels I probably don't have access to, are kind of the things going on all around us all the time, and maybe the things that a student picks up, or maybe that a teacher picks up and learns from their students, that weren't planned and just kind of come together.
Hmm. Yeah, interesting answer. I'm just curious, how much does Hebrew language factor into your courses?
Well, we in the courses I teach, not so much. I mean, in the social justice course I teach, social justice, activism, and Jews, I lay out 3 or 4 basic terms for them: tikkun olam, tzedek, and staka. And we study a few passages from the Torah. We look at Cain and Abel, and I kind of walk them through the verse where after Cain kills Abel, and God approaches Cain and asks, where's your brother? The phrase that your brother's blood calls out from the earth, and we look at that, the Hebrew of dam, and it's actually demei achicha, the bloods of your brother, and I kind of try to explain to them. I mean, if you don't know Hebrew, and certainly if you haven't gotten to the level of like singular and plural, it doesn't mean much. But it works itself in, and I just try to explain. Listen, in English, the word blood doesn't actually have a plural, so it doesn't really. You can't even totally translate it. But in any event, it comes up here and there, and I try to unpack it to the best of my abilities, knowing that I'm not teaching a Hebrew language course.
Right.
What do you find to be your biggest challenge as an educator?
I'd say some of the biggest challenges I've had as an educator, say at USF in the last 15 years, have to do with my non-classroom responsibilities. So dealing with other faculty or dealing with administration, which is certainly part of being an educator, but for me, not my favorite part. In the classroom, the 2 biggest challenges I've had over the years are when I've had students who cheat. And one time, and this is relevant to this podcast, I used to teach the Intro to Judaism course, like I said, and I had a project where the students, for their final project, could really do their project on anything related to the course. And I had a student where, they have to write their proposal and everything, so I can kind of guide them to the right texts or something, because some of them are really, this is the first time they've ever encountered any of these ideas in Jewish studies,
Right.
in Jewish community. So I once had, this is about 10 years back, I had a student, she was going to do a project on the Holocaust, on the Shoah, and everything looked fine in her proposal. And then she wanted to do it on Holocaust denial. And I was like, okay, that's a great idea. And then when she gave her presentation in class, she offered the idea that her thesis was that there's validity to those people who deny the Holocaust.
Oh, interesting.
So my mouth like just dropped. I was totally taken off guard. And it was that she was the last presentation of the day. Fortunately, one of the advantages of having students for a semester is you have a full 15 weeks with them.
Right.
So you develop some sort of relationship. And it wasn't the last day of class. So even though I was totally taken aback and didn't even know what to say, um, I collected myself after class, and a few students came to my came to my office, and we talked about it. I spoke to some of my mentors on campus, and in the 2 days between class, I brought her into my office, and it was very clear to me she had absolutely no idea that that's not a credible academic approach to genocide in World War II, right? She wasn't an anti-Semite. She wasn't. This isn't how she was raised, and she was propagating some sort of conspiracy theories. She found a book in the library, a few books, and she took the books on face value, as if the propaganda in the books was fact. So we sorted it out, and I explained to her how in certain countries, especially in Europe, it's literally against the law to deny the Holocaust, and how denying a people's genocide is such a very baseline way of denying their existence. And it ended up being a pretty valuable lesson, hopefully for her. I don't know, definitely for me. Our next class, she apologized to the class, and she shared what she shared with me, that she had no idea. And then I kind of tried to turn it into a lesson for all of us. But that's probably one of the biggest challenges I ever faced. And thankfully, I had the time to react in a constructive way,
Right.
because it wasn't a one-off presentation where I was in some setting I've never been in and never will be again. And but that was a big one.
Well, and it was good you used it as a learning opportunity for the whole class in the end.
Yeah. So, but that was only because I had the time and the space. It was a Tuesday, Thursday class. I had her on a Tuesday, and by Thursday, we started class with her apologizing. And but these things happen.
Sure.
So how do you stay motivated as an educator?
With the speakers I bring for my social justice class, I said I bring in about 10 speakers a semester, and many of these speakers, even if I've had them multiple years, they say different things different years, and they help motivate me. And my students constantly help motivate me, and the people I work with, they help motivate me. And then at the end of the day, when I come home, I mean, the last 12 months have been out of the norm, right? I don't come home. I am home all the time. But when I come home from teaching, and I have children. I have a 13-year-old boy and a 10-year-old girl. And so that reminds me of who I want to be and how I want to act and how I want to spend my time. So all of those pieces of my daily and yearly life help. I guess it's kind of the structure I've helped create to keep myself in check to a certain degree. Because
So,
when one reads the news, it's definitely easy to get disheartened.
say bar mitzvah boy, huh?
Yeah, he had his bar mitzvah a couple weeks back.
Wow.
Mazel
Mazel
tov.
tov.
Thank you. It was pretty wild because we had it at home, and when me and my partner, we kind of co-wrote our speech together, and in the beginning of my part of it, I shared how 13 years ago in this exact room, many of the people that we had at our bar mitzvah were also at his brit milah.
Wow.
And that's, obviously only because of the current circumstances with COVID were we in that situation, but it was pretty profound in its own way of being in the same exact room when we brought him into the community at 8 days, now 13 years later. or bring him into the community in a different way. So that was pretty cool.
That is
Yeah.
pretty cool.
What advice would you give to new educators who are just beginning their journeys in the field?
I would suggest that a new educator keep some sort of pedagogy journal where they, I keep track of what I teach, so that the following semester, I have the lesson plan, right? And then I tighten it up each time. But I would even take that to the next level but I don't do this myself, of some sort of journal about teaching, and what worked and what didn't, and like a professional journal, but where you're very raw with yourself, about how you taught and what you thought you did well and what you didn't. I think that would be really valuable. But again,
Yeah, no, it sounds like a great idea. I was going to ask if you journal.
I used to journal a lot, but excuse me, pre family and pre kids. Say in my 20s, I journaled a lot, and way early 30s, but mostly 20s. But I never journaled professionally. I mean, if I was in like a 3-day workshop, I might have journaled professionally, right? But not consistently over time.
Yeah.
How important would you say it is to mentor or have other educators that you consult with or learn with, or
I'd
that
say
sort of thing?
critical. I mean, it's always good to have people who have been in a particular setting longer than you that you can rely on and go to if you have a challenge. I thankfully have 3 or 4 mentors at the University of San Francisco,
Right.
that I lean on when need be. Then I have some colleagues that in the Jewish Studies program that we can confide in one another. I mean, in a sense, we mentor each other, but it's not the same. We're more on the same level, so to speak, and I kind of hold my mentors on a higher level. But I'd say it's pretty key. It also can help keep you in check, and help, if something serious happens at work or something, I check in with my partner about it, and likewise. But I'd say it's imperative to have mentors and people you can rely on, especially professionally, to help you through, whether it's a dire emergency or it's something just more low key of how you want to handle yourself better, or what have you. But I'd say it's really important.
How can we help students to build a proper Torah foundation? I know you're a professor. I wonder maybe how this question would be different for you in terms of, when you think of foundation, are you thinking like younger students, or can you do foundational work, even at the university level? Or how would you answer this question?
Well, I'd say, whether you're teaching to Jews or non-Jews, if you believe in some of the core values, or at least for me, the core values that come out of the Torah, like B'Tselem Elohim, right? Created in the image of God. The baseline commandment or idea of this course, if you will, every human life has value and purpose. And that idea is absolutely, at least for me, a Torah idea. I've studied other religions, so I know enough to know it's an idea found in all sorts of religious traditions. Thankfully, it's not only that Jews who have that idea, it's all sorts of groups. But probably the guiding values that shape what I want students to come away with in my courses are found in the Torah, and they're the parts of the Torah that I gravitate towards more than any other. It doesn't matter to me that most of my students are non-Jewish. They're students, and they're undergrads. I don't orient towards a Jewish student differently than a non-Jewish student insofar as my responsibility to them.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm still teaching the same, I would say, Torah values in class.
Right. So I'm just curious, what do you do with things like, we're just been reading about the Mishkan, the Tabernacle. Now we're doing Vayikra, Leviticus with the service in the temple and everything. I mean, on a certain level, some of that stuff is it's not always equitable, right? Like, you have different tribes, you have the Levites. So
Sure. Well, when we get into those conversations, which isn't that often, just because of what we talk about and what the content is of in class, is more on contemporary events and texts. But we do talk about stuff like that, and I would say something along the lines of, well, there's all sorts of ideas in the Torah that I don't agree with, and you know, verses that we can justify and say it was the time and place when these texts were written or what have you, but they certainly are not ideas that speak to me. I mean, there's some pretty harsh passages in the Torah. The Mishkan is just can become more of a dry section of the Torah and a little bit not so interesting on face value. But I also teach, when relevant, I teach that the way that Judaism has evolved and grown over time is that certain texts have actually become more important to Jews than the Torah itself, ironically. And it's kind of a concentric circles thing where that you have interpretations upon interpretations upon interpretations. And to the extent that, thankfully, some of the verses that I think are incredibly problematic, to say the least, aren't verses that people follow anymore and haven't for centuries.
So, what do you think that successful Jewish education is going to look like in the future?
No idea. I think one problem is that a lot of the resources in the Jewish American community, say, which is what I know most about, which does have 1/3 of the Jews in the world live here, or actually more than that. 40% of all Jews live in the United States. I'd say a problem in how Jewish education is formulated here in the States is that not enough focus on diversity of Jewish opinion, even though we purport that there is. I'd say there's a lot of similarities if you look at the curricula of Jewish day schools across the country. There's a lot more similar than different, and it's more liberal out here in California, especially Northern California, than it is back east, no doubt. Think that we're still stuck in old models of teaching things. So the future, I have absolutely no idea, but I would hope that a lot of the organizations that really shape curricula used in Jewish settings and environments around the country, I would hope that they would not be so monolithic and not so homogenous and so conservative, small c, and would open themselves up to more ideas and more diversity of opinion within a Jewish context.
I wonder how things will change in the future, especially right now, given what we're doing with COVID and how that's affecting education. And
the practices that Jews have change over the course of time. But I'm not, to get back to one of your earlier questions, I'm not sure what threads it all together, because there are very distinct practices of Jews from all over the world. Things have become more streamlined in the last 100 years because now we have 80% of all Jews live in only 2 countries. But 140 years ago, when you didn't have millions of Jews in the United States and had thousands at best in the land of Israel, Jews were really, really dispersed. So you had much less streamlining of any ideas. But that has become more the case in the last 140 years.
Right. Professor Aaron Hahn-Tapper, we'd love to continue this conversation with you another time. But we really just want to thank you for being here and having this discussion with us, and wanted to know if, just as a final question, you had anything else you wanted to add, or just let people know, where they can find you. That is, if you want them to find you.
There's only 4 Hahn-Tappers in the world.
Wow.
My partner was a Hahn, I was a Tapper. We became Hahn-Tappers. So if you spell it right, you're going to find me on Google. Her name's Lori and my name's Aaron. So there's only one Aaron Hahn-Tapper out there.
Nice.
Right.
Nice.
In our universe. So it's pretty easy to find me. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
We really learned a lot, and all the best to you and your family.
Thank you very much.
All right. Be well.
Thank
Talk to
you.
you soon.
You too. Bye-bye.